In the previous video, we covered the different types of research that can be used in order to answer questions and test hypotheses. This video, we are going to talk about the different types of samples that scientists use in order to either make a generalizable study or explore more in depth into a single population. Let's start with some basic definitions. The population is the entire group of interest, and a sample is the portion of the population that you have in the study. Sampling is done since it is infeasible to study an entire population, either due to cost or time. The goal, however, is to choose a sample that represents the entire population so your results can be generalized to the entire population. The list of possible candidates for your study is called your sampling frame. This is where your sample will be drawn from. Ideally, your sampling frame should contain everyone within your target population. However, it is usually just the more accessible portion of a population. The sampling frame also sets the inclusion and exclusion criteria, such as with age, sex, or socioeconomic status, and many other factors. This is where you can also decide between using a probability and non-probability sample style. Sampling error can occur during the sampling and design process. There can be differences between sample and population characteristics that can be due to a design flaw or lack of an understanding to underlying constructs. For example, you may choose to sample everyone that goes to a midterm about their confidence levels and find that everyone is extremely confident. However, what if students that were unconfident simply did not show up to the midterm? Increasing sample size usually reduces sample error, as a larger sample will be more representative of the general population. As you get larger and larger, you can eventually encompass the entire population. However, there are also techniques that minimize sampling error when increasing sample size is infeasible. Next, we will discuss some of these techniques. There are two categories of sampling techniques: probability and non-probability sampling techniques. Probability sampling is the random selection of patients which reduces biases and ensures representative sampling. The list of probability sampling includes simple random samples, systematic samples, stratified sampling, proportional stratified sampling, disproportional stratified sampling, and cluster sampling. Let's break down these sampling methods before moving on to non-probability sampling. First of all, simple random sampling. Each member of the population has an equal and independent chance of selection. The choice of one person does not bias another. An example includes random phone number generation and pulling names out of a hat from an existing population. Note, random sampling is not the same as random assignment. Random assignment is the randomization of dividing samples into groups, while random sampling is the choosing of the sample itself. Systemic sampling. It is easier than random sampling at times since it can be done with computer assistance and use pre-existing lists such as birth certificates in a country. Essentially, this method just chooses every X name on a list and contacts them. This generally produces a random sample unless the lists are put in an order that affects outcomes. For example, every other person must be of the opposite gender. This can mean that if we choose every even number on the list, that we will end up with a sample of only male or female. Stratified sampling. This is used if people in the population differ systematically along some characteristics, and this characteristic relates to the factors being studied. These factors can include age, sex, and economic status. This means that the population must be further divided into subgroups or strata, hence the name. The samples are randomly drawn for each subgroup. The number of samples chosen for each strata gives birth to the next two categories: proportional stratified sampling and disproportional stratified sampling. Proportional stratified sampling takes number of participants of each strata in accordance to the proportional representation in the population. For example, the proportional representation for each strata in LFS for sex is determined to be 75% female and 25% male. Thus, for a study that is based on proportional stratified sampling stratified by sex, we will randomly select 75% females and 25% males for participation in the study. This results in a random sample that selects and reflects the proportions in the population. In disproportional stratified sampling, we use equal numbers between each strata. This means, despite the proportion in population, we will take an equal sample of all strata. In the previous example, it means taking the same number of male and female participants despite the 75-25 proportional difference in the population. The last type of probability sampling we will cover is cluster sampling. This is used for convenience sake if clusters and natural groupings already exist in the population. An example would be geographic boundaries such as by city or school districts by school. Participants are not randomly selected, but rather groups of individuals are identified and groups are randomly selected. For example, of all schools in a province, you randomly choose 10 schools, then proceed to interview everyone in those schools. Next, we will move to non-probability-based sampling. Non-probability-based sampling has non-random selection of subjects. This helps scientists to isolate a problem or characteristic that they are testing for. This consists of convenience sampling, purposive sampling, quota sampling, and snowball sampling. Convenience sampling is usually done with an easily sampled population, such as prisoners or students in your class. This can be a weak representation of a general population. However, it can lead to faster and more convenient data. Purposive sampling is based on researcher-specific criteria. For example, patients chosen to try a treatment method based on how likely they would comply with a certain treatment. This is mostly used in qualitative research and works as a background for future double-blind tests. Next is quota sampling. Quota sampling is used when stratified sampling is desired but not possible. Participants with a characteristic of interest are randomly selected until a set quota is met. The characteristics are usually identified and stated in the study. A quota is the set number of participants needed for each characteristic. The last form of non-probability sampling we will cover is snowball sampling. Snowball sampling is where you use subjects that are currently in your survey to recruit future subjects. This is usually biased by social network of the subjects. However, this can be a useful bias for studying a particularly hard to reach group. In summary, in this video, we have covered probability and non-probability based sampling and the cases in which we would use the different types of sampling.